All right. This is the forum scene from William Shakespeare's Julius Caesar. So, if you were there for the class wherein I gave you the background, it is essentially based on a historical character of Julius Caesar and his eventual assassination. But Shakespeare gives it a more moral examination, right? Now, you have to remember two characters. One is Brutus, who was Julius Caesar's very close, dear friend, a trusted companion, right? And that is why Brutus's betrayal comes across as not just um, politically wrong, it's not just a treason, but it's more so a moral sin that he commits because he betrays his friend, he betrays his brother, right? And you have to remember another character, which is Mark Antony. Mark Antony is also a very close friend of Julius Caesar. But you through this forum scene, you examine how these two characters represent two forms of friendship, two forms of relationships, right? Now, Brutus, who was manipulated and tricked by Cassius and all the other conspirators into believing that Julius Caesar was bound to become an ambitious, tyrannical, autocratic leader, and thus would be a bane or would be a destructive force in Rome, decides to commit treason and assassinate Julius Caesar for the good of Rome. Right. So the forum scene is post the assassination, post the murder of Julius Caesar. Right. Now they have to explain to the crowd, to the people, why is it that they've killed their king. Right. So Brutus and Cassius, they divide the crowd into two different groups, and they decide to and they deliver their reasons. Right. Now, this entire play, what you can expect are questions along the lines of the power of language, right? How does Brutus and Mark Antony represent their ideas, right? So, Brutus is the first to go up on stage and speak to the crowd, right? So, Brutus, then follow me and give me audience friends. Cassius, go into the other street, right? So, both of them decide to take different sections of the crowd. Now, the crowd, keep in mind, they are very anxious, they are angered, they are confused, they are enraged, they want answers, right? So, they're quite riled up at this point. And so, it's a very tough crowd, but Brutus steps up on stage and he decides to speak. Be patient till the last, Romans, countrymen, and lovers. Hear me for my cause, and be silent that you may hear. Right? Now, there are a couple of lines that you can make note of, and you can also reference this in your answer as well. Now, believe me for mine honor, and have respect to mine honor, that you may believe. Censor me in your wisdom. Right? So he presents himself as an honorable, trustworthy man. Right? And the even though what he has committed is murder, there is a just cause for it. Right? If there be any in this assembly, any dear friend of Caesar's, to him I say that Brutus's love to Caesar was no less than is his. If then that friend demand why Brutus rose against Caesar, this is my answer. Not that I loved Caesar less, but that I loved Rome more. Right now, this is a very powerful and a very important line from the forum scene. Right, so he justifies his reasoning for killing Julius Caesar by stating that the reason why I killed Julius Caesar was for the good of Rome, right? Was to sustain the purity, the uh, power, and the democratic republic of Rome, right? So he says if there's anyone in the crowd who is an ardent supporter of Julius Caesar, who is a closer friend, I can tell you, I can vouch for it that I am a much dearer, closer friend. So he, in one sense, presents himself as a martyr, as a sacrificial, selfless figure, right? Somebody that has sacrificed his friend for the honor, for the sake of Rome, right? So here, what does he do? He compares two different forms of duties. One is personal duty as a friend versus a public duty, which is as a citizen of Rome, right? Had you rather that Caesar were living and die all slaves than that Caesar were dead to live all free men, right? So he constructs this narrative that he has killed Caesar for the good of the people of Rome, right? If Caesar had continued to be the king of Rome, he would have enslaved all of them. He would have taken away their rights, he would have taken away their voice, right? So what he has done is for the long run of the democratic power of Rome. Right? I honor him, but he was ambitious, right? So in your exam, when you're asked why was Julius Caesar assassinated, this is the reason, that he was believed to be ambitious. He was believed to corrupt the people of Rome. He was believed to become a tyrannical leader. And thus, Brutus has committed this moral sin so as to omit such a pose. Right? There is tears for his love, joy for his fortune, honor for his valor, and death for his ambition. Right? Again, he presents Julius Caesar as an honorable king. Right? And he says that despite the fact that we've committed the assassination, we will still honor his memory. He was a good king, right? Because he did bring glory to Rome. He did bring peace to Rome, right? So he says, and thus we will honor his memory, but we have to be weary of his ambition, right? And thus, this is Brutus's reasoning as to why he killed his dear friend and the leader of Rome. So the people are, of course, they're convinced, right? Because after all, he managed to kill an autocratic, tyrannical leader for their sake, right? Then none have I offended, right? The question of his death is enrolled in the capital, his glory not only extenuated, wherein he was worthy, nor his offences enforced, right? For which he suffered death. Right? So the consequence for his ambition was death. Right? Now enter Antony and others with Caesar's body. You can make note of it. Now, this in your exam, another question you can expect is a comparison between Mark Antony and Brutus's speech. Right? What makes Mark Antony's speech more powerful? So I will make note of a couple of elements. You can also make note of it in your answer. Now, Mark Antony, he's very theatrical, very dramatic, in fact. He enters in the middle of Brutus's speech, along with a few of the other conspirators, with Caesar's bloodied corpse, right? So that itself is a very vivid image. Here comes his body, mourned by Mark Antony, who, though he had no hand in his death, shall receive the benefit of his dying, a place in the commonwealth, as which a few shall not. Right? So he says, here comes Mark Antony, who had nothing to do with the murder, but the murder will definitely benefit Mark Antony as well. Right? Long live Brutus! Of course, the citizens, they are enamored, they are happy, they are fortunate to have such wonderful leaders who've taken this decision to kill such a corrupt leader. Right? So Brutus suggests that the countrymen, the citizens, they listen to what Mark Antony also has to say. Right? So for the grace of Caesar's corpse and grace his speech tending to Caesar's glories, which Mark Antony, by your permission, is allowed to make. Right? So he says all of you have to wait until Mark Antony presents his points in order to honor his dear friend's memory. Right? And thus he exits the stage. At this point, keep in mind that the crowd has completely believed Brutus's side of the story, right? They are convinced that Julius Caesar was an ambitious king, was a corrupt king, was an unethical king, and so his murder was necessary for Rome's survival, for their survival, right? So they have completely, blindly, passively believed what Brutus has said so far. Now you have Mark Antony that goes up on stage. And again, it's a very powerful, popular speech. Most of you would be familiar with. Right? Mark Antony. Friends, Romans, countrymen, lend me your ears. I come to bury Caesar, not to praise him. The evil that men do lives after them. Right? Uh, yes. So he says, and again, this is what makes Mark Antony very clever. Right? Uh, Understand that he's also a very close friend of Julius Caesar. He is a grieving friend. He's a friend that has been betrayed. He's a friend that is mourning the death of his friend, right? All of you can expect certain emotions, which would be anger, right? In order to seek justice for the brutal assassination of his friend. So what does he do? He manipulates Brutus into believing that he is to deliver a funeral speech, right? But Mark Antony's entire speech is an act of revenge, is a way of getting back at the conspirators and especially Brutus, right? With a very apathetic, cold hearted murder, right? Mm, yes. So, right. Now, so yes, he starts. So the good is often interred with your bones, so let it with Caesar. The noble Brutus hath told you Caesar was ambitious. If it was so, it was a grievous fault, and grievously had Caesar answered to it. Here, under leave of Brutus and the rest, Brutus is an honorable man. Right now, here is the first tactic that Mark Antony uses, which is the clever strategy of repetition. Right? In any speech that you take up, in any popular speech, for example, I Have a Dream or Tryst with Destiny, any of the speeches, you will observe that the speakers use the element of repetition. Right? It unconsciously, it's a way of pressing the ideas forward. Right? So here he says that he says, if as Brutus has mentioned, if Julius Caesar was an ambitious king, then he had to pay the price for it, which he has with his death, with his life. Right? And he says, and of course Brutus is an honorable man. Right? Now this statement he keeps repeating throughout his speech. Right? The idea that Brutus and the conspirators were honorable men that protected Rome. But as this repetition goes forward, you will identify a sense of sarcasm, right? Because if you think about it from a moral perspective, what Brutus has committed is murder, right? And it's a sheer act of betrayal. There's no way of justifying it. So here, Mark Antony, the constant repetition of Brutus as an honorable man is to state that he is an untrustworthy, corrupt, vile human being that has committed the most gravest of sins, which is to betray your friend. Right? So here, under the leave of Brutus, he's an honorable man. Now come, I speak in Caesar's funeral. Here was my friend, faithful and just to me. But Brutus says he was ambitious. Brutus is an honorable man. Right? Again, he repeats this. Right? So he says Julius Caesar was a very dear friend. He was honest. He was kind. He was fair to me. Right? But then Brutus says he was ambitious, which again means that Mark Antony does not believe he's ambitious. Because Brutus says he's ambitious, he's considering, was he ambitious? And he says, but Brutus was an honorable man, so I have to believe him. Right? So you start to see the sly sense of sarcasm that comes in. Right? Now, these points keep in mind in your exam as well. Now, this is how Mark Antony breaks down this argument that Julius Caesar was an ambitious king. The first reason is he had brought many captives home to Rome, whose ransoms did the general's coffers fill. Did this in Caesar seem ambitious? So, this is the first reason. He says Julius Caesar was the kind of king that brought back many of the captives from war, and he paid the ransom for it. If he was an ambitious king, would he have done this? Right? If he was a selfish, ambitious, tyrannical king, he wouldn't have cared about the people that were held captive. He wouldn't have cared about the people that were imprisoned. Right? But the fact that he paid the ransom to bring back the captives to their homeland Rome means that he's a very selfless king. He's a very kind king. So that is the first reason that he gives. Next, when hath poor have cried, Caesar hath wept. Ambition should be made of sterner stuff. Second reason that he gives is when the people of Rome, when Julius Caesar, when he passed by the streets and he saw poor, hungry, homeless people, suffering people, right? He was so moved that he was moved into tears, right? Would a selfish, ambitious king be made of such a quality? So that is the second reason. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious. See again the repetition. And Brutus is an honorable man. You all did see that on the Lupercal. Now this again in Act 1. Again, if you were there for the class where I'd mentioned this, Mark Antony, in order to celebrate the victory of Julius Caesar with Pompey, he had offered him the crown 3 times. And Julius Caesar had denied the crown 3 times. Right? So he says, when I had thrice presented him a kingly crown, which he did thrice refuse, was this ambition. Yet Brutus says he was ambitious, and sure he's an honorable man. Right? This is the third point which he gives, which is the conspirators in Brutus claims that Julius Caesar was an ambitious man. Right? He was power hungry. He was after the crown. But I had offered him the crown 3 times in front of all of you, and you all witnessed that Julius Caesar had denied the crown 3 times. Is that ambition? Isn't that a sign of, generosity? Isn't that a sign of humility? So how can you call him ambitious? You all did love him, not without cause. For what cause withholds you then to mourn for him? Right? So bear with me, my heart is in the coffins. with Caesar, right? So he says, I'm sure all of you in the crowd at one point respected Julius Caesar. You all loved him. You all, venerated him. What has changed, right? So he says, so let's honor his memory respectfully. Let's honor it with a sense of dignity, right? Now, another element you need to keep in mind in your answer is the usage of, now, Mark Antony makes use of three elements in his speech, right? The first is logos. Logos is the use of logic, right? So if you observe here in this first passage, Mark Antony uses logic to break Brutus's argument, right? So the claim is Julius Caesar is ambitious. But here is Mark Antony who says that ambition is a quality of greed, is a quality of corruption, right? Villainy. But he has given you instances to prove that Julius Caesar does not possess this quality. So there is a logical reasoning to his speech. Second is the element of pathos. Pathos is the usage of emotions, sentimentality, right? Again, in the first passage, if you observe, unlike Brutus's speech, which was very impassionate, which was very, straightforward, if you observe Mark Antony's speech, it's very poetic. He uses verses, right? He uses language that is very emotional in its tone. Because as audience, again, if you recall any of the speeches, if it is only logical speaking, right? If it's only factual proof, you don't listen as much. But if there is emotion, if there is a narrative, if there are personal experiences, you're more likely to listen and to also relate, right? And the last is, of course, ethos. Ethos is a form of um, is a form of accountability and credibility, right? Which is to essentially ask, why should I listen to you? Right? Now, why will the crowd listen to Mark Antony? Because he is a war hero and he's also a dear friend of Julius Caesar. So he uses three of these qualities to present his speech. Right? Now the crowd, they are a little confused. They were quite conflicted. Should they listen to Brutus or should they listen to Mark Antony? Right? It is found so some will dare abide it. Poor soul, his eyes are red as fire. Right? So they see that Mark Antony is so stirred by emotions, he's so weak and vulnerable. They pity him. Right? There's not a nobler man in Rome than Antony. Right? So you see how slowly the crowd is shifting their perspective, right? They've turned the table. Now Mark Antony. But yesterday the word of Caesar might have stood against the world. Now lies here, O master, I would dispose to stir. I should do Brutus wrong and Cassius wrong. You all know are honorable men, right? Again, the repetition. By this time, the constant repetition of honorable men is a way of insulting, right? That these so called honorable men have committed the highest of sin, right? So now the people are also questioning the, honor, the honesty, and the ethicality of these men that have killed their dear king Julius Caesar. Then I will wrong such honorable men. But there's a parchment with the seal of Caesar. I found it in his closet. 'Tis his will. Let but the commons hear this testament, which, pardon me, I do not mean to read. And they would go and kiss dear Caesar's wounds and dip napkins in his sacred blood and beg a hair from his memory, bequeathing it a rich legacy. Now, the final, cherry on top that Mark Antony presents is that from his pocket he takes out a will, a parchment, a legal proof of Julius Caesar's will that he has left behind. Right? He takes it out and he says, this is the will that Julius Caesar has left behind for the people of Rome. But he says, but I will not read out this will. Right? Now, this is another strategy that Julius Caesar uses, right? Which is in case Brutus and the other conspirators, because they've now by this time they would have realized that Mark Antony is not favoring on their side. Instead, he is trying to rile up the crowd, right? They would ask him to step out, step off the stage and take the will away from his hands. But by asking the by presenting the audience with this will and stating that I will not read it out, he creates a sense of curiosity, a sense of anticipation. So now it's a form of security for him as well. So the crowd, of course, they demand that he read out the will, right? And he says, and if I were to read out this will, you will fall, you'll bow down and fall upon your knees at the sacrifice of your king, right? Mark Antony, have patience, friends, I must not read it. It is not meat. You know how Caesar loved you, right? You are not wood, you are not stone, it'll inflame you, right? So he says the will is so powerful, it is so emotional that you will demand justice. So now, of course, the citizens, they cry and they demand that the will be read out. Will you be patient? I fear I wrong the honorable men whose daggers have stabbed Caesar. I do fear it. Right? So you see now how he is representing these so-called honorable men. Right? He says, if I read out the will, you will question the honor of the men that have committed this murder. You will compel me then to read the will, then make a ring about the corpse of Caesar, and let me show you him that made the will. Shall I descend? Right? Now, this is another strategy that Mark Antony uses. So he says, you want me to read out the will? All right, fine. Why don't you, circle around the, Caesar's body? Shall I descend? So far, Brutus and Antony, they've spoken from a podium, from an elevated height. Right? Now, Brutus, throughout, he spoke from this podium. Now, Mark Antony, in the middle of his speech, he decides that he will be one amongst the people. So he steps down from the podium. This is another clever strategy because it's a way of becoming one with the people. There is a more sense of trust that is built because you're part of them, right? Because a podium essentially maintains a hierarchy, but that hierarchy is broken when he steps down from the podium. So come down, descend, you shall have leave, right? So comes down and they form a ring around Mark Antony and Julius Caesar's body. If you have tears, prepare to shed them now. You all do know this mantle. I remember the first time ever Caesar put it on, right? So he points to Caesar's bloodied corpse, right? And he's worn this mantle. A mantle is a form of a royal gown, a royal cloak, right? And he says, you all remember when this gown was gifted to Caesar, right? It was given to him after the war at Nerva, right? And he says, but look at it now. It is soaked in blood, right? And it has seen the daggers that have passed through it, right? So once this was a gown, it was a cloak of, or a rather a dressing of honor, of glory. But today, if you look at it, it is soaked in blood. It is a form of betrayal, right? Look, in this plain ran Cassius's dagger through. See what a rent the envious Casca made, right? So he starts to recount the murder, right? Through all the well-beloved Brutus stabbed, and as he plucked his cursed steel away, mark how the blood of Caesar followed it. Right? So what is he doing here? He's constructing a vivid image of the betrayal, of the murder of Julius Caesar. Right? So he says, look what Cassius has done. Look what Casca has done. Look what our dear Brutus has done. Right? They stabbed this poor, honest, kind, selfless king. Right? And as rushing out of the doors to be resolved, if Brutus so unkindly knocked or no, for Brutus, as you know, was Caesar's angel. So he says, look, Brutus was a very dear friend of Caesar's, right? And it is Brutus that betrayed him the most. You gods, how dearly Caesar loved him. This was the most unkindest cut of all. For when the noble Caesar saw him stab, ingratitude more strong than traitor's arms, quite vanquished him, then burst his mighty heart, and in his mantle, muffling up his face, even at the base of Pompey's statue, which all the while ran blood, great Caesar fell. Right? So here, earlier on, if you recall, Brutus had mentioned that he did all this for the sake of Rome. Right? He betrayed his friend for the sake of Rome. But now here you have Mark Antony that questions, can you trust a man that is willing to betray his friend? If he is willing to betray his friend, how can you trust him with your country? Right? So he's questioning the morality of Brutus, right? Because the most lowliest of quality is betrayal, right? Is to break somebody's trust. And what Caesar had done for Brutus, for him to overlook all of this and to so unkindly, in such an undignified manner, to butcher his friend, is that an act of honor? That is what Mark Antony questions here. So he says, in pity, their gracious drops, right? So the image of Julius Caesar's last and final moments are, played out to these people. And you can imagine the kind of fury, the kind of, see, the sense of justice flows with these people. Oh, piteous spectacle, oh, woeful day, oh, traitors, villains. So you see how earlier the crowd, they were siding with Brutus. They were celebrating Brutus because Brutus had said that Julius Caesar was ambitious and he had to be killed. But now they realize the follies. They realize that this was an act of treason. It is the most lowliest of acts. Right? revenge about seek, burn, fire, kill, slay. So the crowd is moved into a sense of, frenzy, and they want blood on your hands. Stay, countrymen, Anthony. Good friends, sweet friends, let me not stir you so much to a sudden flood of mutiny. That's why he says, I don't want you to rush into any form of violence. Right? They have done this deed, and again he says, those who've done this deed are honorable. Right? So you see how clever Mark Antony is. Right? He constantly presents himself as not wanting any war, not wanting any conflict. But he has essentially, what has he done? He has put the gasoline, and he just added gasoline to the fire. That's what he's done. All right. Now, what private griefs they have. Right. Now, come on, friends, to steal away your hearts. I am no orator as Brutus. So he says, I'm not a good orator, a good speaker as Brutus. Right. All in while, these are all, forms of sarcasm. But as you know, plain, blunt man that love my friend. So he says, I'm not a politician, right? I don't understand the ways of politics. I come here only as a friend that is mourning the death of his, brother, right? So all of this is the usage of emotions. Now, action, no utterance, right? Show me sweet Caesar's wounds, poor dumb mouths, and bid them speak. So he says, I shall, for every wound that has been inflicted upon my dear friend, I shall ask for justice, right? Now, finally, my friends, you go down not what herein hath Caesar thus deserved your loves. Alas, you know that I must tell you then you've forgotten the will I told you of, right? So by this time the crowd they're in this maddened state, right? They want justice for the king that was brutally killed, right? So they are out to get them. At this point, once again, Mark Antony reminds them about the will, right? Here is the will, and under Caesar's seal to every Roman citizen he gives. You can make note of this for your 2 markers and also for your 5 marker, right? So for every Roman citizen, Caesar has left behind 75 drachmas, right? So that is again quite a sum. For every citizen of Rome, Caesar has left behind some amount of money. Along with this, he hath also left you all his walks, his private harbours, new planted orchids on his side. Tiber, he has also left them you and your heirs forever common pleasures. Right? So the land of Rome, the luxuries, the beauty of Rome that he has so meticulously crafted for his people, and it will live for generations. Right? So land and wealth and prosperity, all of which has been left behind Caesar for his people. So what a generous, kind-hearted king. Right? So this is the fourth reason. So totally there are 4 reasons that Mark Antony presents. One is that Julius Caesar was not an ambitious king because he paid the ransom to bring back the people of war. Right? Second, he was moved to emotions when he saw the poor, hungry people of Rome. Right? Third is that when the crown was offered to him 3 times, he had denied it 3 times. And the fourth is the very generous will that Julius Caesar has left behind. So the crowd, come away, we'll burn his body in the holy place, right? So he says, we shall demand justice and we shall seek the life of the traitors, right? And with this, the crowd disperses into a fury, out to get, the lives of Brutus, Cassius, and all the other conspirators. So Mark Antony has successfully carried out his revenge. So Mark Antony's final words is, now let it work mischief thou art of fruit, take thou what course thou wilt. Right? So his entire plan, when he stepped foot on that stage, was to create chaos, was to create a conflict, which he has done. Right? Because his friend was brutally butchered by the conspirators. And the only way that he can retaliate is through the power of language. Right? So that is one of the important elements in the speech, right? So in your exam, the questions you can expect are comparison between Brutus and Julius Caesar's speech. Brutus's speech, if you observe, it's very logical, right? It does not present any emotions, and because of which the crowd is not able to relate to him as much. Whereas Mark Antony presents logic, emotions, and he uses credibility. He becomes one amongst the people, right? So the 4 points that I mentioned, make sure to highlight that in your answer also, right? So the themes that you could mention are, of course, the first is the power of rhetoric or the power of language. Both Brutus and Julius Caesar, they're presenting their version of the truth. Brutus genuinely believes that he killed Julius Caesar for the sake of Rome. Brutus did not kill in order, because of selfish desires or, cruel intentions. He did not do it because of any of such reasons. He did it purely for the sake of Rome, right? Because he believed that Julius Caesar was becoming corrupt, was becoming ambitious, because these were the lies that he was fed by Cassius and all the other conspirators. So Brutus believes what he's saying is the truth, right? But Mark Antony also presents his version of the truth, but the crowd believes Mark Antony's version of the truth. So, definitely the power of language, how language can trick, manipulate, influence the people, right? How language can present their version of the truth, right? So, that is one of the themes. Second theme would definitely be betrayal, friendship, brotherhood, revenge, all of which is explored in just the forum scene, right? And of course, a larger theme would also be ambition, how ambition becomes the driving force for Julius Caesar's death and also for the conspirators' attempt to kill Julius Caesar. Right? So these elements can be examined in your answer. I think with that, we will end the lesson.